it should update here.
Oh wow.
The stream is gone. You're on starting. So when you go here, when you click this button, it's actually going to change your screen. So you need to pay attention to this thing. You need to also yeah.
but that is something like this. Testing, testing, testing. Mario, hi. Hope you're doing well. Connection, testing. Are you doing well? I wonder. Testing, 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 testing. Testing, 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 testing. Testing, testing, testing. Yeah. All is well, according to Mario, so blame him. Can you check again? Can you check again? Just wanted you to check again, because like we changed some of the settings accidentally. I don't know. Yeah, probably a bit down. I don't know. All is good. Doesn't really matter. I think it going yellow is like actually quite fine, because like I'm actually very close to, unlike most people would be.
So I'll adjust it so that it's going into the yellow once they start.
Yeah, basically. Also, you might want to adjust it on here.
Adjust it on here first, then adjust it on there.
Yeah, because like usually this would be enough.
Okay.
And I just keep it like around 15 or so.
Okay.
So like I usually keep it here. And, like you can always lower the volume
Sounds good.
as long as it doesn't go into red. Okay. Cool.
Hi, everyone. Check, check. Hello. Can you guys hear me? All right. Thanks so much for coming, everybody. Feel free to take your seats. We're going to get started here. And yeah, if it's your first time here, welcome to Trajectory Labs. We are a nonprofit that aims to facilitate Toronto's contribution to the most pressing issues in AI. And we do events almost every Tuesday and Thursday. Tuesdays are usually some sort of policy event, and Thursdays are more technically oriented. If you need to go to the washroom, just outside the glass doors, coming back in, be sure to use the PIN code. And yeah, thanks so much for coming. Oh yeah, also this talk is going to be is being live streamed to YouTube. So if you do have a question to ask, your voice may be on the YouTube video. So just a heads up there. It's not going to be on the YouTube video. We may paraphrase you for the YouTube video, but your privacy is likely intact. Yeah. How discussion-oriented do we want this presentation, Catherine? Very discussion-oriented. So your questions are welcome. I'm going to put down a rule that if you have like an idea that sounds vaguely related and it takes 3 minutes to tell, not a good question to have during the presentation. If you have questions or critiques or concerns about the presentation content, very much throw up your hand. Catherine will call on you. But yeah, without further ado, big round of applause for Catherine Gardhouse.
Thanks, Mario. How's this coming through? Going right? Good. Fancy new microphone. I haven't used this before. So yeah, welcome from me as well. Thanks for those of you in particular who paid to be here. I think that's the first time anyone paid to hear me do anything, so that's kind of cool. I think Mario covered all of this, so I'll dive right into introductions. So usually on Tuesdays, it is myself and my colleague Wim here, the in-house policy nerds, co-hosting this and taking turns presentations with a bunch of guest lecturers coming to support us as well. A little background on me. I'm a lawyer by training. I also work as the volunteer policy lead at AI Governance and Safety Canada, which is a small nonprofit that is dedicating its few resources to making sure that AI regulation in Canada also takes into consideration the future risks of very advanced AI and making sure that there's potentially political will being built for tackling these really difficult policy issues. In my sort of like full-time job, I'm currently a summer research fellow at the Institute for Law and AI, also a nonprofit particularly focused on the US, but also the EU. I'm working on the EU team, contributing to a legal commentary on the EU AI Act, in the course of which I'm writing the section on agent governance and enforcement powers of the AI office. And yeah, this is also the first time that I get to say I have a PhD in philosophy, because that just wrapped up last week. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think technically I'm like clear to graduate. The convocation ceremony hasn't happened, but don't tell. Yeah, and after the summer research fellowship, I'll go back to the Future Society, where I'm going to be an associate on the EU team as well. Cool, and that's Mario. Today's topic is how well does the EU AI Act regulate frontier model providers, and this is generally the agenda. I'll give a quick introduction what the EU AI Act is, its scope, and then what the code of practice is, very importantly. I'll get to that. Its scope, and then the provider obligations, and what that does in order to mitigate systemic risks, and then basically an evaluation at the end to determine how successful we think the AI Act is doing that in terms of preventing or addressing the most concerning risks from AI. A slide on what that is exactly a bit later. Then there are high-risk AI systems, which are subject to the most stringent obligations. Then there are low-risk AI systems, which are basically not really regulated. It's just sort of like good for innovation in those areas. Well, I mean, there might be some like transparency requirements, and then there are ones that just completely fall out of scope. And then there are the very special categories of general purpose AI systems and general purpose AI systems with systemic risk. And these fall outside of this pyramid scope. They are sort of, yeah, tagged onto it very late in the negotiation process of the AI Act, which makes the whole system, the whole framework of the AI Act sometimes a bit difficult, because not all the provisions have been adjusted in order to account for the fact that it is now also covering general purpose AI systems, which maybe I should mention quickly. That's basically what you would assume it means, the big models of the big providers. Okay, quickly, the scope. So this is the EU AI Act, but make no mistake, it does very much apply to systems that are developed or models that are developed outside of the EU AI Act under the conditions listed here. Possibly the most interesting one or broadest one is that the output affects persons that are located in the EU. So you can understand that however you will. We don't quite know yet, but potentially you can appreciate how broad that might be. So it is generally completely recognized that OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, and Meta, and xAI, and so on would be captured if they provide their models or systems on the EU market in general, which they do. So they were quite involved in the process of the drafting of the code of practice, which I'll get to in a moment. The second point here is what portions of the AI lifecycle are captured by the AI Act, and it's a bit of an interesting question because technically the AI Act says that it captures AI models and systems once they are placed on the market. Also, basically once they're commercialized, but it's not necessary that it's commercialized, but they need to be available on the market. But on the other hand, there are clearly provisions in the AI Act that you need to follow certain obligations that are imposed that you need to comply with prior to placing it on the market. So things like risk assessment before you ship your model or your system. You obviously have to do those prior to shipping it or making it available on the market. So it's not completely accurate to say it only applies once the system is on the market, but yeah, things like enforcement, for example, will be certainly much easier once the model is on the market and you actually see how risks potentially manifest. But we'll talk about that a bit more later on. And then just sort of to highlight an interesting exclusion here is that it doesn't capture all kinds of AI uses. The potentially most concerning one for the purposes of this community here is that national security uses are explicitly excluded. This has to do with the general competency of the EU. It just doesn't have the competency to regulate national security. So simply what the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union requires. Okay. Here you go. This is your list of prohibited AI practices. I think what's interesting to note here is that it has nothing necessarily to do with capabilities of the model. Okay, so that's generally a criticism that the AI safety community often utters, that it's not prohibited to develop a misaligned system that self-replicates and blah, blah. So those are not considerations that factor into whether an AI practice is prohibited. Similarly, this is the category, these are the categories of high-risk AI systems. Terribly sorry that you can't read this, but essentially there's a very long list of union harmonization legislation where an AI system could be a safety component of a product or be itself a product that is subject to these regulations. And so in here you will find things like safety component of a lift or civil aviation or medical devices, marine equipment, things like that. Okay, so if it's a safety component of that, or if it itself is a product that falls under these legislations, then it would be a high-risk AI system. That's already a pretty broad scope. And then there's a special Annex 3 here that lists other areas. If the AI system is used in those contexts, it will also be considered a high-risk AI system subject to the most onerous obligations under the AI Act as they apply to systems. And so examples here are biometrics, if it's integrated in critical infrastructure, if it has to do with determining access to education or sort of like important public services, law enforcement, migration, administration of justice, and things like that. Okay, so that's quite a bit already on the scope. Let me pause here and see if I'm going at a decent speed. Any questions came up so far? Cool. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Okay, so for the online audience, the question was whether non-military use of drones is potentially covered under the EU AI Act. So I would have to really read the fine print here and see whether it says drones. I don't know, maybe marine equipment, like underwater drones or something. I'm not sure. Equipment and protective systems intended for use in potentially explosive atmospheres. Maybe that could be a drone. So well, yes, but you would have to find a very specific hook. Just because something is a drone wouldn't necessarily qualify it as a high-risk AI system, because to my knowledge, there's no EU regulation that just a blanket legislation covering drones. It kind of depends on the particular area in which it is deployed. Good. Cool. Okay, and then to the area that really mostly interests us for purposes of today's presentation, what are general purpose AI systems and general purpose AI system with models with systemic risks. So basically, I said this at the outset, it's kind of what you assume it is. It's the big models. The requirements here in the definition is that it's trained on a large amount of data, could use like self-supervision at scale, significant generality, capable of competently performing a wide range of distinct tasks. So kind of what you assume general purpose AI means, right? And then the important one here is general purpose AI with systemic risks. Systemic risk means risk of a large scale harm for the most advanced at any given point in time or from the model that have an equivalent impact. So it's a super convoluted definition. There's a recital in the AI Act that spells out in more detail what those systemic risks are, and we get to that in a moment. For now, a good sort of like rule of thumb is the most capable models out there, such as whatever, I guess now it would be GPT-5 and things like that. So examples just to get us started is sort of biological weapon development would be a systemic risks, unintended issues of control, and then there are certain criteria in the AI Act on the basis of which a decision can be made of whether something is a general purpose AI with systemic risks, such as the number of parameters, the amount of data, and the number of registered users. But more detail to come there. Okay, so this is a question that has been bugging me in my work a lot, which is the difference between an AI model and an AI system. You probably caught me referring to both quite a bit, and it's unfortunately not super clear line, but it is actually really important that we know where that line is, because if something is a system, as you heard, if it is a high-risk system, at least much more onerous obligations will apply to the provider of that system. So just to give you a sense, all we know from the AI Act is that a model requires additional further components, such as, for example, a user interface to become a system. That's not, legally speaking, a definition. It doesn't mean that everything that has a system necessarily is, an interface necessarily is a system, but maybe that's a good hint. But yeah, it's not super clear. And then AI system here itself requires, for example, varying levels of autonomy. But there's also a recital in the AI Act that speaks about the autonomy of the model. So it's super unclear where that line is to be drawn. So I will flag that here, and we get back to that later in terms of assessing whether the AI Act is doing a good job regulating frontier model providers. Maybe one thing to note is, if you think of things like ChatGPT or anything that you can directly use by, via your browser, for example, you are most definitely interacting with a system, not just a model. So the heuristic here is pretty good. If you say, if there's an interface that I can use, then it's quite certainly a system already. But yeah, what exactly these further components here are supposed to mean is somewhat unclear. Cool, okay, so now the code of practice. The code of practice is a lengthy document divided into 3 different chapters that concretizes what the obligations in the AI Act are, because they are really set out only on a very high level. That's not a flaw, that's by design. The idea essentially being that high-level obligations are flexible enough to apply to technology as it develops. So if you don't have too specific obligations on the level of the law, then that means it's sort of, to an extent at least, future-proof. And then you have sort of, if you will, lower level codes of practice, or sometimes they're called standards as well, that you can change a little bit more easily without having to go through the entire democratic process of amending a law. Okay, so that's basically why that why that is. And then, so it's super interesting how this code of practice came into being. It was a massive coordination of almost 1,400 different stakeholders. And this includes representatives of the large frontier model providers. So OpenAI and Meta and Google and Microsoft and all those guys and gals had a hand in what the code of practice provides. So they were part of the many, many workshops and panel discussions that determined what obligations are encoded in this code of practice. But not only industry, but also civil society, my organization, the Future Society, as an example, but many, many others as well. And sort of like civil society organizations that care about human rights and all those sorts of stakeholders. There were 4 working groups. I'm not going to get into too much detail here, except I want to point out that they were actually led by really impressive people, and the AI safety community was really quite pleased with the personnel that led this effort, all on a volunteer basis over 9 months, and it was quite a challenge to coordinate these many stakeholders. So a really big achievement, I find. This code of practice came out in, oh, don't let me lie, I think August, maybe, quite recently. And there was a major political win system providers can use in order to demonstrate that they comply with these more high-level obligations. So there's essentially then an assumption of compliance. If you can demonstrate that you comply with the code, that you are then compliant with the EU AI Act itself. And so all of the big ones, except for Meta, signed. At least they signed the chapter that deals with the security aspects. There are 2 other chapters, one on copyright and one on transparency. But that was a major win from a political perspective on the side of the Commission. What this means for Meta then is that it needs to demonstrate in some other way, not using the code of practice, that it complies with the UAI Act. So it doesn't mean that Meta now falls outside of the scope of it, that it doesn't have to comply with the UAI Act. It simply means that it says, nah, I'll do it differently. It might still do it exactly the same way as the others, but it won't say so. And then the consequence, the Commission said, would be that it will be subject to higher scrutiny. Okay, so that was kind of like the vehicle to convince the providers to sign that they will have that sort of like additional trust if they made a good faith effort. So that's what the code of practice does, and that's why it's so important to discuss it, because it sets out in much more detail the obligations that the providers have under the UAI Act. But importantly, it can't go beyond the obligations under the UAI Act itself. It just sort of like specifies them. Well, technically it could have, but it wouldn't have been binding. Okay. A little bit more about the scope, which is really important from an AI safety perspective. So first of all, open source models are to a great extent exempted from certain provider obligations, with the exemption to this exemption of systemic risk general purpose AI, which is good. But also tricky, because certain obligations such as like post-market monitoring can be quite difficult with open source models. So some uncertainty on how that's supposed to work on that front. The other one that's concerning is the exclusion of AI systems or models that are used internally only, that are not put on the market, if you will. These are concerns essentially for the reason that some of you, or most of you perhaps, are familiar with, that you might have AI models of capabilities to the effect that they could potentially get out of control if you deploy them internally, and then they are able to exfiltrate themselves, for example. They might very well have effect on systems outside of the internal one in which it was deployed. So the fact that this is not in scope is quite problematic, and again has to do with the competency of the European Union in general. Now, as I said at the outset, this R&D phase post-deployment is necessarily still regulated to an extent, because there are certain obligations that these model providers have that you can only comply with prior to deployment, which is providing quite a bit of uncertainty of this provision exactly. So how do you credibly make the claim that, well, I never meant to ship it, so I didn't have to oblige by the requirements. It's like quite some uncertainty there in general as well. Okay, fine. Now, let's get into the weeds of the actual obligations, at least after I have a sip of water. Okay, this gave you a chance to read that, at least if you have super vision. Like, honestly, I made this bigger, but I think I shared the slides before I did, so I tried and failed. Okay, so I'll go into this in quite a bit of detail, though you won't miss anything. Okay, so there's a difference, as you can see already, given the structure of my slide here, between obligations for general purpose AI and then general purpose AI with systemic risks. And here I'm specifically drawing from the Code of Practice, which again concretizes what the AI Act requires. Okay, so providers of general purpose AI models have to document certain technical information and then make some of this information available to downstream providers. So conceptually what's going on here is that it is obviously quite natural or assumed that a general purpose AI model is integrated into an AI system down the road. Really, that's how you benefit from the technology, make it commercially useful. So it makes sense that the model provider provides some information about this model to the downstream system providers, because only then can the downstream system provider comply with the obligations that they have under the AI Act, because oftentimes this requires information about the model itself. One example is that the system provider has to have certain data management procedures in place which comply with data privacy law. And they obviously will not be able to do that if they have no clue what the model was trained on, because that's the prerogative of the model provider. And then other information, which is actually much, much broader, needs to be provided to the AI office, which is the entity, the sort of like subsection of the European Commission that is responsible for supervision, monitoring, and enforcement of these obligations. I will quickly say that the scope of the information that is required to be provided to downstream providers versus the scope of information that has to be provided to the AI office is quite different, and you can make a case that the minimum requirements that are specifically spelled out in the AI Act of what has to be sort of like included in the information to the downstream provider is not actually quite enough to enable the downstream provider to comply with their information, with their obligation. But there's this catch-all phrase in there that, well, the model provider has to provide them all the information that they require to comply, but then the minimum requirements that are listed are really, really thin. Cool. Okay. Another obligation of general purpose AI model providers is to put in place a policy to comply with copyright. Cool. And then make publicly available, that's interesting, a sufficiently detailed summary of training content. Okay, that's also quite vague, but I guess it's a good start. Cool. Okay, and then the much more, as you can see, much broader obligations of general purpose AI model providers that have systemic risks. This is sort of like the entity to which the safety and security chapter of the Code of Practice is addressed to. And so there's a whole host of obligations here. You have to adopt a safety and security framework. So if you are familiar with the framework that I believe Anthropic piloted, this like safe scaling framework or whatever that's called, that's basically the inspiration for this obligation. So that's pretty good. What you have to do there is essentially to set out thresholds at which you consider mitigation measures to be required, and also a threshold where you say, that's going too far, I will not deploy from here on out. So it's like these different safety levels that you might be familiar with. Then there's a whole host of systemic risks. I think they're on my next slide, so just bear with me for a moment there. So you have to identify these systemic risks in a very systematic way. You have to have internal evaluations and sometimes also have external experts, we'll talk about when exactly, to check for systemic risks that are posed by your model. You have to analyze them and set risk acceptance criteria, as well as have appropriate safety mitigation in place to mitigate these systemic risks. There are certain provisions around security, so have to protect your model against cybersecurity attacks or leakage. There are reporting obligations to regulators. They're really problematic. They are not structured in a way where they need to be provided to the regulator before you put the model on the market, which would make a ton of sense for scrutiny of whether you are compliant before you expose a bajillion users to your models. But unfortunately, you have to do it by the time you put the model on the market. And there's this wonderful possibility of delaying it by, I think, like 10 business days or so, if the AI office considers you to act in good faith. Yay. Okay. You have to have certain internal governance structures in place. So basically say, this compliance officer is responsible for these risk mitigation steps or analysis or whatever. There are serious incident reporting requirements, and then transparency requirements as well. Okay, that's quite a bit already. Let me pause there and see if something came up. Ooh. Test, test? Good, okay. Does that entice anyone to speak up now that you can be heard? Okay, never mind. Okay, all right. So moving on. A question that may have come to your mind, and if it hasn't, then maybe it does now, is, so who exactly is responsible for the systemic risk classification that is generally presumed? So I should take a step back. There are certain risks spelled out in the AI Act that make it a systemic risk, but to facilitate the classification as systemic risk, there are compute thresholds in the AI Act that can be adjusted when necessary, under which a general purpose AI model would be presumed to have systemic risk. So I think we're currently at like 10 to the 25 flops, something like that. So if there is a risk classification due to this presumption of this, because this threshold has been met, the provider can request a redesignation as an exception. So it can make a case under certain circumstances that, well, yes, the threshold is met, but look at this, there are actually no systemic risks here. Bit unclear of how that's supposed to work, but it's a possibility. And then it's also good to note that a list of general purpose AI with systemic risk models has to be made public by the Commission, so that the public can be informed about what models fall under this. Any? Can you switch slides? No worries. Great. Okay, so sorry for that. This is recital 110, pain of my existence. This is where systemic risks are, well, not defined, because recitals, FYI, are not legally binding. They are essentially interpretive aids, if you will. But it's the only spot in the AI Act where we get some tangible clarity on what the heck this means. And I bolded some of the really interesting ones, which are actually quite good from an AI safety perspective. So let me point out degree of autonomy really matters when you assess whether something has systemic risks. Self-replication abilities, the ability to train other models is being considered. Cyber capabilities, the ability to produce chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear risks or for use for weapons. And then in general, anything any event that can lead to a chain reaction with considerable negative effects that could affect up to an entire city, entire domain, or an entire community. So that's not too bad, but it's super broad and also not super concrete in all instances. But yeah, good start. There are other things like manipulation and things like that as well, but just highlighted the ones that I considered perhaps to be most relevant for the current context. this here is what the code of practice made out of it. It essentially provides a list of 4 areas of risk that it considers systemic risk. We have again here chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear risk, loss of control, big one, cyber, and then harmful manipulation down here. So these are the risks that the model providers, if they develop models with systemic risks, need to look for when they do their evaluations and their risk assessments. Not bad. Comments, thoughts, questions? Yeah. So the question is whether an external expert panel has some guidance of what would constitute a systemic risk. Yeah, I suppose they would also look to the AI Act and then to the Code of Practice on how they concretize it. No, nothing that is sort of like more binding. I suppose you can always go to the external literature and see what people are concerned about, and you can flag that in the hopes that maybe the attention drawn to it makes a difference. But in general, systemic risk is essentially what the AI Act and the Code of Practice set it out to be. But it's fairly broad. So okay, I can say what's not included, perhaps in case you didn't spot it. So things like disruptive effects on the labor market. That's not a systemic risk that is considered under the AI Act. Gradual disempowerment for like political decision making or so on. That's also not included. And these are not like blatant oversights or something, but they also result from the fact that the European Commission is only permitted to regulate in certain areas. And so labor, for example, is a member state obligation, just as national security, for example. So they just don't have the power to regulate in those areas. There was a hand here as well. Thanks.
Have sort of thought that whatever this legislation is doing, it's trying to regulate not the real potential of current AI or neural networks, but their own fears that grow from mass culture or cyberpunk literature, and not like the real problems that can like be occurred by using these AI systems or AI models.
So is there a question there or just a comment?
No, like it's more or less a comment. This is my feeling that they are not like trying to regulate the real problems and the real issues that can occur by using modern AI systems, but something that they are afraid of. For example, sentient artificial intelligence.
Sure. Let me make a comment as well. So I would invite you to perhaps read the International Report on AI Safety, which has been written by an enormous number of experts in this field, which very much points to these specific systemic risks as well. Plus beyond, they do indeed address things like the effect on the labor market that could result from mass automation and large-scale job loss due to AI agents taking over or having the capabilities of taking over jobs. So as far as I can tell, the scientific backing of caring about these things is as solid as it gets at this stage in the early development of this technology. Other questions? Please.
Okay. I was interested, I know that you said that these companies have to self-regulate to see, if I remember correctly, whether or not their models kind of incorporate systemic risk. let's say they don't figure it out, and then suddenly we find out like 6 months after a model's release that it does have significant risk. Someone's able to build a bioweapon with it, maybe just in a hypothetical way where, but basically the company had the model, it had this risk, and they didn't catch it. Is there any kind of flack that they will receive or any punishment that they will receive just simply for not being able to classify the model, or is it just until something actually happens as a consequence of that they'll have to face consequences for it?
Yeah, good question. So essentially that gets at the root of how are these things enforced, right? And so that is worth its own talk, but just to, I guess, answer your question to the point is, no, there are absolutely consequences that they face. So under the EU-AI Act specifically, there are fines that you can impose, but more so perhaps measures that a provider would fear beyond just fines. Is the ability of the European Commission to require the withdrawal of the model from the market or the recall of the model, or to restrict the making availability, the making available of the model on the market. So that obviously would be a big bummer because then you cannot commercialize the model anymore. So you have a massive incentive from that perspective to comply with this and to do proper risk classification. So that's certainly the case. How enforceable a market recall is, on the other hand, stands to be determined. But it's there. Yeah, right behind you, if you wouldn't mind, perhaps.
Does that mean that if your company is reliant on a model that gets recalled, then you are dependent on the provider and therefore your systems are going to shut down, and you're not going to be permitted to use that model anymore?
Yeah. Like if you can switch in a different model, then I mean it's probably prudent to build your systems in a way where they're not dependent on one model because it could potentially be recalled. It can also be just sort of like taken back by the provider on their own account, presumably, unless you have sort of like really stringent contractual obligations that they promise to make it always available. But I guess there could always be sort of like internal issues that would warrant it for a provider to withdraw access for security reasons. It doesn't necessarily have to be because the European Commission requires that for compliance purposes. But yeah, for what's that called? Robustness purposes, you probably want to make sure that you have some fallback option, perhaps like an open source version or so that you can run locally or things like that.
Thank you.
Can you pass the mic?
Sorry, would you mind behind you? Thank you, Georgia.
I got a question. What about privacy? Because in my mind is like, okay, the AI model, it's out in the market, and because of the interaction of users and everything, it could be a potential risk. But what about the privacy of the interaction itself? Because I know that the EU has a very strong privacy law in general, regulation. How does this play, or how this come in, like how this merge?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so you have to sort of distinguish between privacy concerns that would result from the training process, in which case it's the prerogative of the model provider, which is kind of who we are concerned with most at this stage, to ensure that they build their models in a privacy compliant way, which they haven't. The thing that you seem to hinted at more so is the actual use. So if you feed your chatbot personal information that you have no consent to do so, for example, of your clients or something like that, then that's your fault, and you are very much subject to the general data protection regulation under the EU. That's out of the scope of the AI Act because we have the GDPR, so the AI Act didn't need to address that. From the model or system development perspective, there are certain obligations in there. I mentioned one already. This is in Article 10, which is addressed to the system provider, not the model provider, where they have to have certain data management measures in place, for example, being cognizant of the original purpose of the collection of the personal data, which, as I mentioned just now, is really something they can comply with unless the model provider tells them, what they trained the model on, right? So that's certainly a potential coordination issue right there. But yeah, definitely the AI Act in general is very cognizant of privacy risks. It has a recital that spells that out quite precisely, and it also says specifically that the general data protection regulation of the EU is applicable to AI in any case. So it's no carve out by any means. Just because it's AI, you can process any personal data. Definitely not. And then there are specific obligations actually when it comes to AI systems that would do that would process biomedical data and things like that. So biometric is what that's called. Yeah.
Thanks. You hinted earlier about the reason for the systemic risk classification is probably due to a lack of resourcing at this point to, have someone come into every model provider's sort of system or institution to try to figure that out. So I'm kind of curious at this stage, and you did mention that it's a 2-year sort of implementation for this act. What are the resources that are actively, are there, I guess the first question, what are the current resources to enforce this? And then are there any proactive measures? And you might get into that later, but is there any sort of active, proactive, enforcement to seek out things at this stage?
Yeah, okay. So specifically the enforcement powers of the AI office, which is tasked with enforcing against the model providers specifically. So there's this distinction, right? Against AI systems, it's the member state obligation to enforce. So as soon as the model is built into a product which is made available on the market and you meet the AI system definition, it's actually the business of the member states and the market surveillance authorities to enforce. They have quite similar powers, like market withdrawal, recall, on-site visits, documentation requests. They can do evaluations and all that sort of stuff. But when it comes to general purpose AI models specifically, then it's the job of the European Commission to enforce the obligations under the Code of Practice. I don't know the exact numbers of the staffing at the AI office. Last I heard it was around like 130 or so, and they're not all on the job of enforcing. So lots of them would write guidance and help providers comply and do sort of like administrative stuff. In terms of the checking of the risk classification and general risk determination, I mentioned that some models are required to undergo evaluation of external evaluators. There are a bunch of criteria of who could qualify as a competent person to do that. And so those could be things, institutions like the AI Safety Institute in the UK, Security Institute in the UK, and there are other non-profit organizations that specialize in model evaluations. And so they collaborate with the AI office quite closely. And so you can consider that as a proactive measure, essentially, where essentially the AI safety community is getting behind this and builds the expertise to support the effort to make sure risk classification and risk mitigation and assessment and so on are carried out properly. Did I address every aspect of your question there? Okay, good. Excellent. All right. Annie's gone. Okay, so I've done all of this. Cool. Okay, so this now we're made it to the last 2 slides where we're going to assess and evaluate what we learned and make a judgment essentially of how well the AI Act and the Code of Practice govern frontier model developers. So here's the good, and then the next slide is the not so good. So first of all, on a plus side, there are actually a bunch of systemic risks that are in scope that general purpose AI model developers have to consider and assess. They have to do that throughout the entire life cycle. So this is this business which we touched upon earlier, that it's not just at the moment where you place the model on the market, it's actually throughout the entire life cycle, which is great. So during the training process, even the design process, you basically have to do risk assessment and mitigation, which is great. And then here's the point again about the external evaluation. Well, actually, yeah. So this is interesting to note here that if you do have the obligation to have an external evaluator involved, you need to give them at a minimum 20 business days to do these evaluations. I'm not an expert in this field, but to me it seems intuitively short, mainly because it's really difficult to prove the absence of a risk, right? It's basically just you're limited by your imagination of what you test for, but that doesn't mean that when the real world deployment happens and there are, I don't know how many millions of users that use it very creatively, it couldn't surface systemic risks that you didn't catch during the 20 days of your evaluation. So, and now there are these interesting carve-outs. So you don't have to do an external evaluation if the model is considered a similar, safe, or safer model compared to what's already out there. There are some criteria of what that means exactly, but basically the result of this provision is that you only have to do this if you are at the cutting edge of the frontier. When it comes to safety in particular. So to me that sounds like some lobbyist from industry was quite successful and snuck that in there, and it smells like a loophole to me, but I don't know, can't really put my finger on that too concretely, is to be seen. And then this one's also interesting, when the provider wasn't able to find an adequate external evaluator, and they have to prove that they really tried very hard. And they also have certain notification obligations to the commission that they weren't able, although they tried so hard, before they shipped the model. So, okay. Also good is that incident reporting is required, including near misses. So, and this also applies not only after deployment, but even during training and testing. Generally, it's also good that they have to provide a summarized version of the model report on their website. This is important for scrutiny of nonprofit organizations, by profit organizations of these models. They have to have at least something that you can imagine is similar to the system cards that have already been published, but now there would be a legal obligation to actually do so. Oh yeah, actually I just remembered what I didn't say in response to your question, but really wanted to mention. The enforcement powers of the AI office to enforce the code of practice, they do not come into force until August next year. That's maybe also a tiny detail that's important, which doesn't mean they can't start supervising right now, but they wouldn't be able to impose fines or ask for model recalls and things like that. Good. Oh yeah, and then another benefit that we haven't really talked about yet is that the general existence of the EU AI Act can have the positive effect to spur regulation in other jurisdictions. We said at the outset that its general scope is already so broad that it would apply to model providers even though they are generally headquartered in the US, as long as they are interested enough to ship their models on the European market. So they would still be captured. But it is nevertheless beneficial to have equivalent legal obligations in other jurisdictions, because technically you could imagine that a model provider ships a safe version of their model that they properly evaluated onto the European market, but they could deploy a separate one in, say, the US or something. And then you might imagine that if that one goes rogue, it will not respect European borders. So yeah, and then sort of case in point, essentially, there was a letter sent by OpenAI openly to the governor of California, I believe last week, perhaps 2 weeks ago, that said, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea to say that if you comply, dear provider, with the AI Act, then you're also considered to be compliant for whatever purposes required under California law. So you can see this in action already, which is kind of cool. Comments, questions? Want to see the less good?
So just regarding the EU AI Act, so would you say that it's maybe too vague in certain areas? and because after all, there are no precedents, no cases tested in court. So how could it be enforceable?
Okay, let me take that apart. At one of the early slides, I said something like the AI Act has fairly high-level obligations, and then it's the code of practice who spells that out in much more detail. Obviously, this only applies to general-purpose AI models with systemic risks, but there will be guidance forthcoming by the European Commission that details further aspects of the AI Act and makes it much more concrete. In general, the reason, the fact that something is high level doesn't mean it's not enforceable. I think perhaps to concretize your concern as I hear it a little bit more clearly is that providers might be able to say, but I did comply, I understood it this way, if there is room for interpretation, right? So if something is vague, you could say, I have my own interpretation of what that's supposed to mean, and perhaps that's something that is divergent from how the AI office would interpret this provision, and then they potentially have to battle it out in court who is right, and whether the sort of less onerous interpretation of the model provider prevails. That wouldn't be decided until years down the road. So that certainly is a concern. But on the other hand, if the AI office took enforcement actions, for example, a model, then you would first have to oblige by with that request, and then you can fight it in court, and then it's your problem that you can't do anything for 3 years. It wouldn't be the case that you can keep your model running as long as you are tying the commission up in litigation, right? So, and then for your point about precedents, well, yeah, that's of course true, but that's the case with any new law. Obviously, the moment it comes into force, you won't have a bunch of, like a big corpus of case law that concretizes it. But in general, that's just how the civil law system works, right? You operate with the statutes that you have and then general principles of interpretation that would apply. And then you have literature around it by experts that are writing, for example, legal commentaries on the EU AI Act to guide the implementation and your understanding of what you're supposed to do. But yeah, it's certainly, there are lots of uncertainties under the EU AI Act, which are concerning, and some of those I pointed out. Would I say it's too vague? I think they are big blunders in the drafting process that led to uncertainty and inconsistency in the AI Act, which are unacceptable for a legal framework of this importance. But that is simply the effect of the process by which it was what was drafted. So it's something quite common on the EU level, but it's a massive political mess with lots of like, oh, I give you this and then you give me that, sort of like trades going on, and that can often lead to inconsistencies and uncertainties. So just to give you a clearer view of what that looked like, there was a period of, I believe it was like something crazy, like 72 hours or so, where these negotiations, the final ones, because they were working up against the deadline, were undertaken without anyone leaving to like sleep or go eat or something like that. They kept them in a room, or they like ended up sleeping on the side and stuff like that. It's like, it's pretty crazy how this negotiation on the EU level takes place. So it's not necessarily always terribly well designed, but it was also in a way necessary to just get it across the finish line. But it ended up with a bunch of inconsistencies that my team, for example, now has to grapple with to try to make sense of. So there's certainly issues with it for sure. Spam filters. Yeah, so the question is, what do companies not have to worry about because they are such low-risk systems that they fall out of the scope of the AI Act? And the standard example is spam filters, yeah. Yeah.
You've used the term model recall a few times, and I'm just wondering if, I don't know if you'd call this the Brussels effect, but I'm just wondering, is the effect of a model recall, notwithstanding the fact that it's EU, is the effect of a model recall going to be global? Because can you recall a model and somehow maintain it outside of the EU and not still fall offside the EU AI Act?
Unfortunately, it's limited to the EU. So essentially, what a recall means is that it's no longer available on the EU market. So it would not necessarily have any effect of the availability of the model on any other market. So the way you would do that is essentially say to the provider, hey, do not provide any API access to anyone from a European IP address or something like that. Yeah. They are possible enforcement measures under the Market Surveillance Authority regulation, which apply only to AI systems. And the most intrusive one is that you can actually destroy an AI system, in which case the system is no longer usable anywhere. But as it goes with software, maybe you have a copy that you still use in the US then or something, so yeah. Please.
Thanks for the talk, Catherine. Recently, there was an announcement from the UN of these two mechanisms that were created, a global dialogue on AI governance and an independent scientific panel on AI. Do you see that somehow affecting the EU AI Act or the European Commission or EU, I guess, working together with UN on sort of like a global level of governance?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know exactly what the level of involvement of EU experts are. What I can say is that there are several provisions in the Code of Practice that make reference to things like state of the art, for example, or best practices, things like that, which are very importantly shaped by expert panels, for example. So if they conduct research and then they determine, oh, you know what, actually there's this new evaluation that you can do, or this new benchmark that's terribly insightful to surface systemic risks or something like that, that would have an immediate, it would have a potential effect on how the AI Act is interpreted and enforced. So these sorts of efforts when it comes to experts putting the work in to determine what should be considered state of the art when it comes to risk assessment and mitigation, that's super crucial for sure. Yeah. And I can also say that the AI office plays the role of the European AI Safety Institute with the general ambition to foster international governance efforts as well. So my understanding is that there is a team that is particularly tasked with that sort of work. Okay, last slide. 1 sec. The less good stuff. I hope you can read this one. Okay, but I'll go through it. So the biggest concern that the AI safety community constantly complains about is basically that there's no pre-deployment scrutiny, right? So we said that at the outset that the AI Act generally applies from the moment that you applied, or I don't think the risk mitigation measures are adequate. So that's not great. And then there's this little detail here of a potential delay of 15 business days if it would otherwise interfere with deployment or something like that. But you have to at least act in good faith from the perspective of the AI office, whatever the heck that means. Another one that people don't like is that, so in previous drafts of the Code of Practice, it went through, I think, 4 drafts or so. They were intermittently made public, so we know sort of like the process it went through. And at some stage, there was pretty decent whistleblower protection. So this is the vehicle through which external scrutiny can be exercised based on information from the inside, right? If employees of the big model providers spot something and it bugs their conscience and they blow the whistle and spread the word, essentially, then you can potentially intervene in some way. But now, all we have is the European Whistleblower Directive, which only applies in the EU. So that is not international scope. And so all the Code of Practice says now is that the model provider has to promote a healthy risk culture. Okay. Too bad. Okay, and I guess this is sort of like a judgment based on the insights that we have, is that if you have something like, or if you're concerned about something like a fast takeoff, then that might be really difficult to mitigate against with the enforcement measures that the AI office has at hand, especially when it comes to things like these sort of risk emanating from internal deployment only. Then there are non-systemic risk models that can still be open sourced. So if you recall, open source models that are not systemic risk, they are exempt from the obligations under the EU-AI Act. And since they do the systemic risk classification themselves, that might happen, okay? It's so it could be like technically classified as a non-systemic risk and then be shipped. And if you discover later, oopsie, it is systemic risk, then you open sourced it and you know what that means. It's irreversible. So it's going to be out there for good. And then sort of an additional concern is that the threshold that I talked about, the 10 to the 25 flops, which forms the presumption of something being a systemic risk model, might not be the best proxy for systemic risk either. So that makes the classification job quite a bit harder. Yeah, I'm not going to get into the technical details of that, but believe me. Then there might also like systemic risk open source model that can still leak in the EU potentially, because like we might not see it coming. Well, if it's developed in some jurisdiction far, far away, China, then it can essentially affect the EU market potentially without much scrutiny there. The fact that military is not in scope is not great. It wouldn't prevent something like a Manhattan Project, for example. It just have absolutely no jurisdiction over that. The question of enforcement resources already came up. So we don't really know yet whether enforcement and oversight can be exercised properly given resources in terms of manpower and also just financial resources to conduct the kinds of evaluations that the AI office is able to do post-market deployment. And then the enforcement start in 2027, August 2027, potentially also not great if you have short timelines. And then there's the invitation to join us on the AIGS Canada Slack if you want to stay in the loop. Yeah, if you're not already on Luma, that's where you can follow our events. And then that would be it from me, unless you have questions.
Thanks for the talk, Catherine. I am wondering what you think of the idea that maybe it could be easy to be almost a bit too harsh on the EU AI Act. On that last slide, it seems like, you know, you could someone could run the risk of trying to like one-shot AI governance, if you will, right? It's like we're trying to solve every problem at once with one piece of legislation. Is there one purpose that kind of builds towards is an important puzzle piece in the kind of AI governance that you'd want to see in general, that you think that the EU AI Act does particularly well, and like and on that view, are there one or two items in that laundry list on the last slide that are particularly egregious?
Yeah. Okay. So point taken. The difficulty we're dealing with is that this is really, really new technology, right? That we don't yet have the silver bullet. We don't know yet what are the most problematic and likely risks that could materialize and what the effective measures are. We have not super great evaluations that don't provide full insight into the capabilities of the models, and we might very well risk over-regulating. That's totally a concern. So from my perspective, the number one governance measure that basically it not fully addresses but sort of enables good governance is insights, right? So having information about what is going on at the model providers, that is basically the prerequisite for any governance measures, that you understand the technology. And so I guess I had this on the good slide here, is that incident reporting, right? And that happens even pre deployment, as I mentioned. So this is already something that you need to do throughout the entire life cycle of the model. So that's fantastic. The general obligation to have at least a summary version of your model report publicly available, permitting the scrutiny of these providers by public organizations, nonprofits, and things like that, that do not have that economic interest that would potentially entice them to not do a great job with scrutinizing these models. That's also really good. So those would be, like, anything that has to do with insight into what's really going on is important, and we're really glad to see that that's going on. In terms of the egregiousness, also kind of related really to the information thing, is that it's not a lot of insight that we have prior to deployment. So I would say if you don't have the information, you can't do anything. So that would be my number one concern, but actually it's really closely tied to the second one there as well, because whistleblower protection, as I mentioned, would be the one mechanism to get you insider information prior to the model being on the market.
Can you just say the question again?
Yeah, so the question was on point one here, the deployment, is there even a way to implement that without overburdening the model provider? Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So one proposal was essentially that you have these clearly defined go, no-go decision points throughout the life cycle, where you say, oh, perhaps when you reach the flop threshold of, say, whatever, 10 to the 23 or so, you have to do a proper assessment. You have to get external people involved at that point already, rather than only at the moment when you try to get ready for deployment. So that would be potentially a good idea to catch things that come up pre-deployment that wouldn't actually be a much bigger burden than what you have to do at the moment of deployment in any case, could be argued. It's the best idea I have on that one. Ensign?
Oh.
I'm curious how the EU AI Acts and codes of practice gets updated. Like, what's the process for updating them, and how quickly can they be updated? Because you mentioned a few times like the 10 to the 25 flop threshold, and I think by this point, like since GPT-4, we've had something like 30 models that have already crossed that threshold. So yeah, like how do we deal with that kind of issue?
Yeah, so it says something vague, like certainly every 2 years for the code of practice, which is again forever, but also if sort of like new insights required, something sort of like slightly flaky, I suppose. But yeah, if you have the right people in the right places, for example, they were until recently the applications were open for the, maybe they still are, for the scientific panel that would be able to, and then the advisory board as well. It's another institution under the EU AI Act. If the right people are included in those institutions that advise the AI office on these matters, that can go a long way to really make the case, no, we need to update this ASAP, then you can make that happen. And then there are different mechanisms to update different things. So this threshold, for example, has a particular provision in the AI Act that sets out when and under which conditions it can be updated. If you need to change the AI Act itself because you realize there's a major blocker to adjusting other things, because again, like code of practice, for example, can't really go legally, bindingly beyond the AI Act, then you have a much bigger problem, because that would involve the entire lawmaking process in the EU, which moves very slowly. So that's not great. But they try to foresee the most quickly changing requirements essentially, and provided for mechanisms to update that more quickly. But I wasn't terribly happy about the 2 year as a default for the code of practice, for example. So that's not super.
Hey, Catherine. Can you go back to the slide on systemic risks and code of practice? Yeah, this slide. So to me, these 4 points look like a benchmark So I think now whenever AI models are released, whether it's the model providers themselves or third parties, they'll apply a bunch of benchmarks. So for example, there's one called GPQA to assess its reasoning capabilities, AIME, which is just a standard American math test for humans, they'll apply that, or SWE verified benchmark for software capabilities. And I think that represents a more objective measure of model behavior. From this list and some of the things you've presented with the EU AI Act, it seems to be a little bit subjective. So I have two-part question. One is there a AI safety benchmark? And number two, do you think would be helpful to integrate those 4 points there into an objective benchmark that, you know, every model, as soon as it's released, you run the model through the benchmark, and it's low effort and it's objective.
So yeah, very importantly, you basically put your finger on how aspirational is this, and how close is it to reality in terms of what the benchmarks and evaluations can provide today. So we don't have any bulletproof evaluation practices that would, beyond any doubt, establish whether these systemic risks exist or not. We're really muddling through. It's a very nascent science and perhaps art to an extent as well, to get at clear assurance whether some of these risks exist or not. I think there's so much work necessary to be done, and I think that the AI Act will pose a great motivating factor for lots of people to get involved with that, because that's absolutely key. Going once. Cool. Amazing. Thanks so much for your engaging questions. Really appreciated that.
Thanks again for coming, everybody. You're welcome to, an hour or so, or until the last Trajectory Labs member goes home and kicks you out. Again, if you want to watch this, this will be streamed to YouTube. And make yourselves at home. No, we're going to just leave this up for a while.